Good morning. I'm just here to introduce and give an update on this past week in Summer Splash. We just finished our 4th week. This is the halfway point. So we just crested over, you know. Thank you. Thank you. But fortunately, it's still not over. So we still have 3 more weeks, 3 exciting weeks. So please keep us in your prayers because we are halfway through. So I think for a couple of us, we are a little tired. But just pray for our energy levels, but more importantly, pray that we maintain sharp and are continually doing this for the right purpose, for God, for the children, and for the gospel. But I just want to introduce this week's mission team. This week's mission team is led by Wayne, and they're from Virginia. So they came all the way up here. So please give them a round of applause. Yeah, they're sitting in the front. During our Linger Longer time, you guys can say hi to them, thank them for being here, ask them how they're doing, how the trip was, things like that. Yeah, okay.
Good morning. Our scripture reading today will be from Psalm 35, verses 17 to 28, and that's page 448 in the Pew Bibles in front of you. How long, Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their ravages, my precious life from these lions. I will give you thanks in the great assembly. Among the throngs I will praise you. Do not let those gloat over me, who are my enemies without cause. Do not let those who hate me without reason maliciously wink the eye. They do not speak peaceably, but devise false accusations against those who live quietly in the land. They sneer at me and say, "Aha, aha, with our own eyes we have seen it." Lord, you have seen this. Do not be silent. Do not be far from me, Lord. Awake and rise to my defense. Contend for me, my God and my Lord. Vindicate me in your righteousness, Lord my God. Do not let them gloat over me. Do not let them think, "Aha, just what we wanted," or say, "We have swallowed him up." May all who gloat over my distress be put to shame and confusion. May all who exalt themselves over me be clothed with shame and disgrace. May those who delight in my vindication shout for joy and gladness. May they always say, "The Lord be exalted." Who delights in the well-being of his servant? My tongue will proclaim your righteousness and your praises all the day long.
There are times when we come across excellent questions that people have for us that cause us to think at a deeper level, cause us to dwell on things that maybe we thought we had a quick answer for, but we kind of realize, oh, there's more to this. This is more complex than I thought before. And I remember many questions that I've been asked by many of you through the years. In fact, I still remember some of the questions some of you asked when I was interviewing here years and years ago. Jackie, I think you were 15, and I remember the question you asked me. And many of you, I remember those questions. And just last night, I was sitting with some of our young ones, Jeremy, and some of our older guys here, Stephen, and we were having these conversations about these questions. Johnny was with us. What are these deep questions on these cards? We had a game night, I should tell you. Some of us were playing things like, I played some checkers. It was very advanced, high-level checkers. We played Jenga. I want to say my team did very well in Jenga. But then we pulled out these cards that Stephen had brought, and they were like these deep, hard questions, probing questions to get us talking about different aspects of our lives. And there was one quote that is attributed to Confucius. He said, or somebody writing for him said, "The man who asks a question seems a fool for a minute, but the man who does not ask is a fool for his life." And that sounds something that we'd find in Proverbs too, that the inquiry of questioning, of asking good questions, thoughtful questions, leads us to things about who God is and about the truth that how God made the world. And we're in the middle of this series called Honest to God, where we're looking at Psalms, and specifically some of the Psalms in the early 30s here. And this one that we're going to kind of focus in has a lot of things too. There's a lot of verses that we're going to cover. But the one thing I want to highlight in this psalm is the author's questions. The questions he has for God. And I think that part of what I'm seeing in this is sometimes we think we bring questions. Maybe we go to an expert, or we go to the pastor if we have a religious question. We go to a professor if we have an academic question. We go to a parent if we have a question about how things work in the world. We go to somebody we think has answers. But sometimes there are questions that we don't really get to the depth of the answer to. They just reveal the relationship we have. And here we're going to see that sometimes the questions that we ask God reveal and acknowledge the limitations and the frustrations, the humanity that we carry into our relationship with God. They remind us that we are just human. And so maybe you've talked with somebody before and said, well, if when you die, what question would you ask of God? What's the first thing you'd want to ask? Oh man, I've been dying to know, how this works or how that works. How does this make sense, or why is this okay, or where did so and so end up? What are the questions that you would have? And I think the truth is we have a lot of questions, and some people realize that we have a lot of questions, and they say there are so many questions that go unanswered that there just must not be a God to ask. There must not be an end to it. And one such man was a director of a famous apocalyptic movie in the 60s, Dr. Strangelove. And he was asked about the concept of the film. It was a very artsy film and talking about how the world was going to end in a big bang and explosion. And he says, the idea of the film is the very meaninglessness of life forces humans to create their own meaning. Man has been cut adrift in a rudderless boat on an uncharted sea. If he's going to stay sane throughout the voyage, he must have someone to care about, something that is more important than himself. So for Stanley Kubrick, he kind of sees that we're alone and everything's meaningless, and therefore you might as well find something to worship just for your own mental health. But this, of course, is not at all what we find the Bible telling us about who we are and who God is. Another maybe more lighthearted, earlier comedian, Groucho Marx, says, "I'm not crazy about reality, but it is the only decent place to get a meal." So, we can look at life as like, well, here we are. We just have to figure this out and try and make some sense into it, put some sense into it. Or, like the questions we had last night at the game night, we can ask questions about meaning and reality and what God intends for us. One of the questions that largely we didn't find we had any satisfactory answers to was, what do you want to be said at your funeral? Maybe it'd be easier to create a list of things you don't want said at your funeral. I could think of a few things there, but these are big questions. But they're questions that tell us and prompt us that there are things that we can be honest about to God that we aren't really going to get an answer to directly. We're not going to get a simple one phrase answer. And some of these we're going to hear from David. How long? Why? Sometimes those why questions. Why me? Why this? Why now? Why did they? These kind of questions. And I'm going to posit that there's a point at which these questions are important because they become a quest. See, these words are related, right? They're from a French word for to interrogate or to seek out. So our questions ultimately become a quest because they acknowledge to God that we're limited. They acknowledge to ourselves that we're frustrated. They acknowledge the humanity that we have before God, that He is God and we are not. So, this psalm, we're going to read through it because I want to get through all the verses, but I won't comment on every verse. There's too many for us to go through every line. But the beginning sounds like the portion we read as well, verse 1 of chapter Psalm 35. Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take up shield and armor. Arise and come to my aid. Brandish spear and javelin against those who pursue me. Say to me, I am your salvation. This imagery is imagery that David's more familiar with than we are. Of course, he was consistently a man of battle, and he would have had a spear near him, a shield. He would have an idea of what the difference between these things were, the buckler and the javelin, how that's different from a spear. You know, we don't use these things, but for David, these are the things that were things to be used by a warrior. And in this context, God is the one who is battling for him in this metaphysical sense, coming up and being part of his team, and he is ultimately saying, say to me, I am your salvation. And this phrase in the original language is poetic, language that we don't get to see much of because we don't know Hebrew. But reading those who do, this phrase is very interesting. It may be translated more poetically into English. Speak to my soul. I am salvation for you. And of course, that I am salvation is the word Yeshua that we get the word Joshua from, that ultimately Jesus is the Hellenist version of Joshua, meaning I am salvation for you. This passage, speak to my soul. It reminds us back of an earlier psalm, Psalm 6, where the author in verse 3 says, my soul is in deep anguish. How long, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, and deliver us to God with commanding almost to God, or asking him to rise up and contend and fight and take up and stand up and brandish and speak. Speak to my soul. Because the questions we bring to God ultimately are going to position us acknowledging our limitations, our humanity, the frustrations that we have in life. And that might be more important sometimes than getting the answer we think we need at the bottom of the test. Verse 4, he continues to say, may those who seek my life be disgraced and put to shame. May those who plot my ruin be turned back in dismay. May they be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. The imagery, here not lost on us who have been watching the news of the wildfires in Canada and in California, these huge fires that are sweeping through areas, decimating some areas, decimating entire towns. In California, I read one of the fires it's consuming like 5,000 acres an hour. So this is the one that you may have seen, the fire tornado that's been on the news. That fire right now is the size of all 5 boroughs and then 50% more. Isn't that enormous? So this chaff being blown away, we can imagine this imagery of like this angel of the Lord who's rushing in to help David. And it's being driven away. He says, may their paths be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. Since they hid their net for me without cause, they dug a pit without cause. Verse 8, may ruin overtake them by surprise. May the net they hid entangle them. May they fall into the pit, their own pit, to their ruin. So again, this kind of imagery of may their own devices, their own evil, their own wickedness, may it catch them instead of catching me. And David seems content just to pray these feelings, these sentiments. He really feels that there are people who are after him. And if you read into David's life, this could be, we'll see in a moment, there's some specifics. This could be any number of places where people were chasing David. He had several times where he was being chased. If we were in a Presbyterian context, one of the moments that we would have with our young people during the catechism training would be answering the question, what is prayer? And for them, they answer it that prayer is offering up our desires unto God. Kind of like we did with our offering. We prayed, this is our offering. We offered these things up to you. Take them, use them as you will. It kind of takes that gift that we've given. It takes it out of our pocketbook, out of our will, and puts it into God's pocketbook, His will. And we trust that the church moves forward in that. And here David's saying, these are my feelings. These are my sentiments. These are my desires. I'm laying them before you so that you can have them, so that you can take them and mold them and use them. But I'm acknowledging that this is beyond me. This is bigger than me. I can't do these things. I'm not the angel of the Lord. I'm not the one who could prevent myself from falling in the pit that they've laid for me. But Lord, you can do that. So he comes back to that, these ideas of acknowledging this limitation that he has, and he says, then, when God answers in the way he will, then my soul will rejoice, verse 9, in the Lord, and delight in his salvation. My whole being will exclaim, who is like you, Lord? You rescue the poor from those who are too strong, the poor and the needy from those who rob them. So from the initial questioning of really the inquiry of, rise up, Lord, help, take this and turn this situation around. Now he's asking a different kind of question. Who is like the Lord? Who is the one who rescues the poor from those who are too strong for them, the poor and the needy from those who rob them? Acknowledging God is this unique kind of God who comes next to those who need him most, those who are most vulnerable. And he says, my soul will rejoice in his salvation. In Psalm 25, we read for our call to worship just later on, it says, turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart, free me from my anguish. Look on my affliction and my distress and take away my sins. So David is again in this chapter, he's identifying himself as the one who is poor, the one who is needy, the one who desperately needs God's intervention. And he says, who is like you, with your special attention to the poor? And again, the unique insight that we've come upon in other texts, that who is like God, or when are we most like God? It is when we pay special attention to the vulnerable. As Proverbs says in chapter 19, whoever's kind to the poor lends to God. He will reward them for what they have done. But of course, none of us is close to God. None of us is adjacent to God's righteousness and goodness or his deep empathy for people. But we say, who is like God? And how can we see who God is like, and we can depend on a God like that, and we can become more like that? And it's not just a question that has an intellectual answer. It's not just a question that says, okay, what are the blanks that I'll fill in here at the bottom of the, God is like, and here's some attributes of God. It's not an intellectual answer. It's an answer that's coming from his whole being. I cry out with all my being, he says. Who is like the Lord? It's like I don't know if you guys have ever seen Ice Climbers. I had the privilege when I was younger of knowing this guy who was an ice climber, and he was 2.5 men, really. But these guys go up on frozen cliffs and waterfalls oftentimes, and they like use these pickaxe hammers to claw their way up to the top of these places that there's no other access to in the middle of the wilderness. And if they slip, it's just, of course they use ropes and they have all these things, but you can imagine they get up there and they have these beautiful views. And in the Rockies, I mean, the views, when you get up into certain places, they're just outstanding. They're amazing. But you realize very quickly that you are about this big and there are views for miles and miles in every direction. And we see the beauty and the glory and the majesty. These ice climbers get to see these views that nobody else gets to see. And God sees 1 million of those. At any given time, He wants. The awe of that moment is a tiny fraction of what God sees. So when we question God and says, who is like God? We are acknowledging again, we are limited. We can see only so much. And that's frustrating for us. That's hard for us. But it also acknowledges our humanity and God's divinity. So he continues. Ruthless witnesses come forward, and again, this is going to sound. He's kind of in the song. He's repeating the ideas. They question me on things I know nothing about. That sounds like me whenever I'm talking to anybody about finances. They question me about things I know nothing about. They repay me evil for good, and they leave me like one bereaved. Yet when they were ill, I put on sackcloth. I humbled myself with fasting. When my prayers returned to me unanswered, I went about mourning as though they were a friend or a brother. I bowed my head in grief as though weeping for my mother. When I stumbled, they gathered in glee, and assailants gathered against me without my knowledge, and they slandered me without ceasing. Like the ungodly, they maliciously mocked me, and they gnashed their teeth at me. So here we have some more detail. David, who is considering himself to be a friend of these people, is now betrayed. And again, this could be, when he was mourning the loss of Saul and Jonathan, his close friend. And then there was a battle pretty much immediately for who would take over the throne. And those who were supporting Saul and his descendants and those supporting David. It could be when Saul was pursuing David, and he was hiding in caves, and David had the chance to even kill Saul and chose not to. This idea that when somebody was sick, that he would pray for them and care for them, but then when the things flipped and he was down on his luck, could be his son Absalom, who he prayed for and longed for his well-being and his health, and yet when Absalom had the opportunity, he usurped his father's throne. In any case, whatever it is, he sees these unanswered prayers not as a moment to say, well, I prayed for him. I prayed for my enemy. It didn't work out. Good. He continued in prayer. He acknowledged that even in that, he would continue. And the contrast here is with the weeping. There's this weeping that David is doing on behalf of these, and then their glee at seeing his downfall. He's been betrayed. And he says, how long, Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their ravages, my precious life from these lions. I will give you thanks in the great assembly, and among the throngs I will praise you. The questions that David is asking God is acknowledging before God his limitations, his frustrations, and his humanity. And ultimately, in them, he's acknowledging what Isaiah writes later, that Isaiah says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Isaiah's writing from the perspective of God towards the people. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts than your thoughts. And Paul writes it to the Romans. He says, the depths and the riches of wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his past beyond tracing out. These questions that we are posing to God are the same questions that all people have. And ultimately, it kind of comes down to often, how long? Lord, how long? I guess here is a good place to just say, as we look at this passage, we see and we hear the language even that Jesus used when he cried out at Gethsemane in the grove, and he said, "If this be your will, let this pass from me. But if not, your will, not mine." As he said as he was on the cross, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These questions that Jesus experienced ultimately were exposing something about the limits and the frustration that he took on himself. Paul talks about it in Philippians 2. We won't look there, but he took on these limits. They exposed these prayers that Jesus said to God, exposed his humanity. And that's the very thing that allows us to go to God with these struggles, these questions, acknowledging that he knows not just an answer, but an experience. He's experienced our suffering. He's experienced our pain. He knows our heart. He knows our desires. He knows all the things that we wish we had a quick answer to. But really what we need is his presence in. These questions we bring to God, they bring us to this moment. And Paul writes that we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Like we sung in that song, that God is working even when we don't see him working, that he's for us, not against us. And again, this passage in Romans 28 is important how we read it, because the words, if we just mumble them up a little bit, we get confused on what they say. It doesn't say that God works in all things good for those who love him. That would mean that everything that happens to us is good. God is making it good. But I think this is a better way of translating it. We know that in all things, God works for the good. That even in the hardship and the suffering, even in the pain, even when there's enemies, even when there's real evil things that God does not like or is pleased by, but he allows us to go through and to experience and be challenged by, that God is working for our good, even in those times. We have been called according to his purpose, a purpose that is bigger than anything that we can journey through. So getting back into the psalm, jumping down to verse 26, may those who gloat in my distress be put to shame and confusion. May all those who exalt themselves over me be clothed with shame and disgrace. He's saying, may those who are using evil be revealed for who they are. But, verse 27, may those who delight in my vindication shout for joy and gladness. May they always say, the Lord is exalted, who delights in the well-being of his servant. My tongue will proclaim your righteousness and your praise all day long. Because ultimately, God will be exalted because he does delight in the well-being of his servants, but ultimately, especially, his servant, his son. And the well-being of his son was finally established not in the moments of the cross. Jesus said, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to be spit on, flogged, beaten, mocked, ridiculed, rejected. And on the third day, I will rise again. Ultimately, the well-being of the servant is the well-being for each of us. So the question turns into a quest. Why, Lord? How long, Lord? What's going on, Lord? These are good questions for us to ask because they acknowledge that we need God. Not just an answer from God. Sometimes we want an answer from God, and sometimes He brings it. But sometimes we need an experience with God. We need to know that He is God. We need to experience that we are His people. There's a lot of no answers in the Bible. Abraham was told no when he prayed for Ishmael. Daniel's friends were told no when they asked to be saved from the fiery furnace. They were saved through the fiery furnace. Jesus asked if this would not be His time, that if this cup could pass. But here's the reality. When we ask God, when we're honest with God, with the things that we're struggling with, that we don't understand, that we're frustrated by, we are acknowledging that He is God and we are not. Let's lift up our voices together in prayer now. And just maybe whatever's on your heart. There's so many things we don't know. We don't have the answers to. But again, so many of them we know that God is working. We don't know His timing. We don't know His purposes. We don't know what He'll bring through it.